Hi everyone, we're looking at the urinary system in this lecture. And to begin, a quick overview of the structures that you'll see in the urinary system. There are the kidneys, the urinary bladder, and how it works is that urine is going to be made in the kidneys and then it will collect into this tube which is known as the ureter. And you have a ureter on either side connecting the kidney to the urinary bladder. And then urine will collect in the bladder until it starts to press against the walls and open up the bladder, at which point you'll feel like you have to go to the bathroom. And then it passes down through the urethra. Now, the size of the urethra will vary depending on male and female anatomy. And the male anatomy is going to be quite large because it runs along the shaft of the penis, and it's a much longer structure. Whereas in the female anatomy, it can be even just a matter of inches or less. So, big difference there in the size of the urethra. But in either case, these are our organs that we're going to be looking at. We're going to first turn our attention to the kidney, the macroscopic anatomy, and then we'll spend a lot of time talking about the microscopic anatomy of the kidney. We'll get underneath the hood and see how it is that urine is produced and all of the mechanics that are behind it. And then we'll talk a little bit about how something known as glomerular filtration rate is regulated. It's an important component to homeostasis. It is very sensitive to blood pressure, and so as your blood pressure increases or decreases, there has to be some way to keep your GFR regulated. So we'll talk about that at the end. All right, quick note here about the bladder. Here the ureters come in. There's this trigonal space which is known as the trigone, and that's where the ureteral openings are found, and then at the bottom, it's sort of like a funnel, is the urethra. Now, a quick note about the male anatomy. In the male anatomy, there is a prostate gland through which the urethra is going to pass. And when that swells or it gets enlarged for any reason, it can actually close off the urethra and make it difficult to void or difficult to pee. Okay, here's what the kidney looks like. If you took a cross-section of it, it looks something like this. There are these characteristic little, they're like almost like cones, think about them. In a cross-section such as this, they look sort of more like a pyramid, so that's what they're in fact called. They're called the renal pyramids. And this is going to be a place where there are a lot of collecting ducts, is what they're known as, and this is where all the urine that is being produced is gathered. Much of the urine is made or manufactured in these regions here of the cortex, and so then from there it accumulates down these collecting ducts in the renal pyramids. And then from there it pools into these larger conduits, which are called the minor calyces. So each one of these things here is a minor calyx, and when the minor calyces come together, it forms a major calyx. You have major calyx, major calyx, major calyx. Where all the major calyces come together, the one final funnel that collects all of the urine of the kidney, it's known as the renal pelvis, and from there then it passes down into the ureter. In between the renal pyramids, there are spaces which are called renal columns, and these are going to be places where a lot of the blood vessels are moving in and out. There's a region in the kidney known as the hilum, and a hilum is a general word to describe the place of an organ in which the vessels and tubes and things enter and exit, and that's no exception here. What's not shown is the renal artery and the renal vein. They would be coming in here through the hilum as well. And just it will be important here as we talk about this to keep in mind that this whole boundary that I'm showing you here is what we would call the medulla or the medulla. It's the inner part of the organ. Contrast that to this part here. This is the cortex of the organ. And that will be an important distinction as we get further into this. Okay, here's the story of how blood flows through the kidney. It comes in through the renal artery, and this is always a startling statistic to me that there is 25% of the cardiac output perfusing this organ, or both of these organs. And just for reference sake, if you were to put your fist, squeeze your hand into a fist, that's roughly the size of your kidney. So look at your two fists, and then just consider that how much blood, a fourth of all of your blood of your entire body goes to those two fist-shaped organs. I mean, that's pretty disproportionate amount of blood going to the kidney, and it's important that it does go to the kidney because your kidney is one of the main places where blood is filtered. Things like nitrogenous wastes are voided from your blood here. Anytime proteins break down or amino acids break down, there's going to be an accumulation of those that get into the blood and they have to get out. And so the urinary system is one place that they do, as well as the urinary system. The kidneys are the main thing that regulate your water balance. So if you have too much water that you're absorbing through the small intestinal epithelium, that's going to get into your blood and it's going to cause your blood pressure to increase. And so in order to take that water back out, there has to be a way to pull it out, and that is in the kidney. But in either case, a lot of blood flowing here. It passes into then the segmental arteries and then the interlobar arteries. You don't have to keep these in mind. But the ones that I do want you to keep in mind then is wrapping around each renal pyramid is an arcuate artery. And off of the arcuate artery are the cortical radiate arteries. And they're called cortical radiate because they radiate into the cortex like this. They're like little spikes. And off of these is where the boundary then between the cardiovascular system and the urinary system is found. So off of each cortical radiate artery are these little branches, which are known as afferent arterioles. And off of the afferent arterioles are networks of capillaries known as glomeruli, or glomerulus for singular. And we'll look at that structure in greater detail here in a minute. So you want to keep in mind what cortical radiate arteries are, what afferent arterioles are, and the glomeruli, are glomerulus for singular. And just keep in mind this snapshot here, because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the microanatomy specifically in this region, and just so you understand where we are and what it looks like, it's helpful to know where in this whole thing we're talking about. Okay, so if I was to enlarge one of these, this is showing us an illustration of what's known as a nephron, and we'll talk in greater detail about those in a moment. But just to start, there's the afferent arterioles coming off of the cortical radiate artery. They come into the glomerulus, and then they come out of the glomerulus. From there, fluid is pushed out of the glomerulus, and it gets caught then into the tubules of the nephron. And so at this point, the fluid stops being blood plasma, and it starts on its journey to becoming urine. And there will be a whole bunch of bends that it takes, but it's going to go through all this tubing in this network and then finally come down through a collecting duct. Each of these bends and twists and turns, there's different segments. They have different names. We'll get into them in just a minute. But the other thing I wanted to show you just generally here while we're on the slide is that after blood comes into the glomerulus, it continues on through the efferent arteriole, and then it continues on through what's known as the peritubular capillary network. Peritubular means wrapping around the tubes, and that's in fact what you see here. Okay, so you got peritubular capillaries going around all of the tubes, and that's going to allow it's that very feature that allows urine to be fine-tuned. Once the blood plasma is filtered out and you have all this fluid entering into the nephron, it's not anything very different than blood plasma, and so there's a lot that is added to it and a lot that is taken away from it as it passes through this journey, and that is that ability to have things taken away or added into the fluid is a product of the fact that there are blood vessels that are in close association with those tubes all the way up and down. So that's the value of the peritubular network. All right, let's take a look at a nephron, an overview of them at least. Nephrons are considered the functional unit of the kidney. A functional unit of an organ is just the repeating unit that gives that organ its specific characteristics. So like we saw that the functional unit of bone is the osteon and the functional unit of the muscle is the sarcomere. Well, the functional unit of the kidney is the nephron. And check this stat out. You've got about 1.25 million nephrons in every single kidney. And if you added them all up, N for N, that's about 85 miles of tubules. So imagine going from like Anoka down to like Red Wing, Minnesota. Take a string that's being unraveled the whole way, and then take all of that and shove it into your kidney. That's a lot of tubing, right? That's a lot of string. So it's always mind-boggling to me, just the amount of plumbing that's going on here in the human body. All right, now there's two types of nephrons. There's the cortical nephrons, and then there are the juxtamedullary nephrons. Okay, cortical nephrons, as the name suggests, they're found mostly localized in the cortex. The juxtamedullary nephrons, they are localized mostly in the inner part of the kidney, the medulla. Now, the cortical nephrons, they're going to be the ones that are more common. About 85% of all of the nephrons are cortical nephrons. Juxtamedullary nephrons make up the minority, but their feature is actually important. They sit right in the boundary between the cortex and the medulla, and they have a very deep nephron loop. And that nephron loop is going to play an important role in establishing what is known as the osmolarity gradient. There's going to be actually a gradient of saltiness here as we go down deeper and deeper and deeper. Up in the cortex, it's not all that salty. Down towards the very distal ends of the innermost regions, it's very salty. And that gradient is established by the longer nephron loops through a process known as countercurrent multiplication. We'll look at that later. And that gradient is going to be very important. It's one of the main ways that you actually are able to reclaim water that's lost and to regulate how much water you will excrete in the urine, which is all very important stuff. All right, here is a snapshot then of all the specific portions that one might find in a nephron. We saw that there was the afferent arteriole, then there was the glomerulus, and then there was the efferent arteriole. Well, wrapping around that then is the capsule, and together with the glomerulus plus the capsule forms what's known as the renal corpuscle. Now, fluid is going to be pushed out of the glomerulus, this network of capillaries, and that process is known as filtration. And that's one of the main three renal processes here that are going to be seen as urine is fine-tuned. After that, the fluid that's collected in this capsule, think about it being like a ball that encloses this spaghetti network of blood capillaries. There's a set of bends and twists, and so it's called the proximal convoluted tubule. Convoluted just means wavy or anything but a straight line. And there's two places where this occurs. So this is called the proximal one because it's closer to the site of origin. Okay. So we have proximal convoluted tubule, and then you're going to have the nephron loop, which descends down and then comes back up, and then you'll have another portion of tubes that move in and out, and this is the distal convoluted tubule. That's basically the regions, and there's going to be specific jobs of each of these parts, the proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, and the distal convoluted tubule. We'll talk about those in greater detail in a minute. And then lastly, then there's the collecting system. This is going to be all of the ducts and the things that collect urine as it makes its way down into the renal calyces and the renal pelvis. What you're seeing here are arrows that are showing you some of the other processes that are going to occur. The other main process that happens is tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion. Reabsorption means things that are lost out of the blood are gathered back into the blood. It's reabsorbed. It was first absorbed at the digestive system, and now it's made its way to the urinary system, and it's lost, and so now it's being reabsorbed. Secretion is the other way around. Secretion is if anything isn't lost here during filtration, there's another opportunity for it to be ejected and then enter into the nephron tubules. So reabsorption and secretion are effectively the opposite. Reabsorption pulls things out of the filtrate. Filtrate would be the name that we call the fluid that's inside the nephron. It's not technically considered urine until it's gathered into the renal pelvis and makes its way down to the urinary bladder. So it's called filtrate, and anything that's brought from the filtrate to the blood is going to be reabsorption. Anything that's brought from the blood to the filtrate, secretion. Here's an illustration of these two processes. So what you're seeing here, this is the paratubular fluid. This would be the fluid that is that would be around the tubes. It's like the interstitial fluid. And it would also be pretty equilibrated with the blood. There's a lot of blood capillaries here in the peritubular capillaries, and the fluid of the surrounding interstitial tissues is going to be mostly equilibrated with the consistency and the composition of the blood vessels. So when you see peritubular fluid, you're thinking this is sort of like the conditions of the blood, the conditions of the tissue, and the cells and such. So secretion, what happens is you have some sort of transport protein. It can either by facilitative diffusion or by active transport, it can pump that solute back in to the tubular fluid. So this is like you've got something in the blood, like a drug or some hydrogen ions, anything you want to get rid of, and they get pumped through the basolateral side of the epithelial cell, and then they get pumped into the tubular fluid, and then they can be lost in the urine. Reabsorption is the other way around. You have something that's inside the tubular fluid, the filtrate, and now you want to reclaim it and get it back into the body. So it goes the other way. Just for interest's sake, here's some of the metrics that show the difference between blood plasma and urine. So the biggest things is that there's going to be a lot more, there's going to be a lot less, rather, of nutrients and minerals and things like that. So for example, in blood plasma, you'll have quite a bit of glucose, you'll have plenty of lipids, and you'll have plenty of proteins. You don't really have any in the urine. All of those components, the sugars, the lipids, and the proteins, they're all reabsorbed. They don't get lost in the urine. On the flip side, you have some waste that accumulate in high abundance in the urine. The nitrogenous waste, there's a variety of different forms. They result from different things, but generally speaking, they're usually the result of the breakdown of proteins. Remember, on every amino acid, there's a carboxylic acid group, and then there is an amine group. Well, the amine groups get lumped together and they can form things like urea, or they can get converted into ammonia. Creatinine is something that's involved in muscle. And so these will accumulate in pretty high degree in the urine. There's not as much of them in the blood, but there's a high degree of them in the urine. And then just the regular ions and things, there's quite a bit more, or they can be at least. This is all highly regulated, but it can be that there's more sodium and quite a bit more potassium that are lost. Sodium is a big wild card. It can either be reclaimed to a large degree or it can be excreted to a large degree. And depending on which way it goes, it will either lead to more water being reclaimed or less water being reclaimed. So it's the composition of sodium, how much sodium is being reabsorbed, that will greatly determine how much urine you're actually producing. And we'll see that. We'll see that here in a moment. All right, now here's a detailed look at the nephron. So we'll start with the glomerulus. Here's what the glomerulus looks like. And this is one of my favorite pictures in the whole book. Here's the afferent arteriole, and here is the efferent arteriole. Well, blood comes in through the afferent arteriole. It's just come in from the cortical radiate artery. And what's interesting about the glomerulus, it's a fenestrated capillary network. Fenestrated means it has little holes in the membrane of the vessels. But in addition to that, there are these special cells called podocytes, which interdigit with one another to create what are known as filtration slits. So you have sort of 2 degrees of filtration here. And this helps to ensure that only really small stuff is going to be pushed out of the capillaries. You wouldn't ever lose things like larger proteins. You wouldn't ever lose things like cells normally out of the blood in this process. It's really just only the fluid and whatever is dissolved in it. Okay, here's a schematic that shows a little bit about what we're talking about here. Here's the endothelium of the capillary, and then here are the little slits of the podocytes here. And so fluid passes through here, and then it has, after that, to pass through again. So it's another degree of selective permeability here to have the pedicles of the podocytes interdigitating with one another, creating those filtration slits. All right, another important region is there's a whole specialization of cells right here. These cells are pretty powerful. These cells here are the cells of the macula densa. There's also the granulosa cells of the afferent arteriole. These cells are going to be highly involved in changing and moderating how much filtrate is being produced. They do that by a variety of ways we'll talk about later. But just on the order of filtration, what it is that actually drives fluid to come out of these capillaries and get collected into the capsular space, there's a few different factors at play. And they will ultimately lead to about 180 liters a day of glomerular filtration. 180 liters per day, that's a substantial amount. Okay, so here are the forces at play. There is going to be simply hydrostatic pressure in these vessels. Hydrostatic pressure results anytime you have fluid pressing against the walls of a container, and you've got blood wanting to pass through here, so it's pushing against those walls. Furthermore, what can happen is that the outlet of the efferent arteriole can be slightly narrower than the inlet, and so it creates something of a bottleneck. Fluid is able to come in easier than it's able to leave, and so it wants to linger here in the middle a little bit, so it creates a higher hydrostatic pressure. So the hydrostatic pressure is about 50 millimeters of mercury, and that's the main pressure that's driving fluid out. There are then two forces that are actually going to want to pull the fluid back in, believe it or not. There is the capsular hydrostatic pressure, and that's going to be the same thing as the glomerular hydrostatic pressure, is just the other way around. There's fluid in the capsule, and anytime you have fluid in a closed container like a capsule, it has pressure on it. So that actually pushes back with a magnitude of about 25 millimeters of mercury. And then furthermore, there is the colloid osmotic pressure. The blood colloid osmotic pressure, not the capsular osmotic pressure. The blood colloid osmotic pressure. Recall that the colloid osmotic pressure is the result of the fact that there are plasma proteins in the blood that can't get out. And so because of that, there's always going to be a slighter, higher amount of particles or solutes in the blood than there is in the fluid that's outside. So that's actually going to force fluid to pull back in a little bit. And that's about 25 millimeters of mercury. And maybe I misspoke here. It's 15 millimeters of mercury for the hydrostatic pressure, 25 millimeters of mercury for the osmotic pressure. And when you balance all of these forces out, you come up with a net filtration pressure of 10. So that's the amount of pressure that is pushing fluid out. And so it gathers into the capsular space, and then it makes its way down the first regions of the proximal convoluted tubule. Now, one of the things that can vary, we said that the efferent and the afferent arteriole, the afferent arteriole being a bigger diameter and the efferent arteriole being a smaller diameter, that helps to drive fluid flow out of here. Well, those diameters are highly regulated. You can either shrink the afferent arteriole or open the afferent arteriole, or the same for the efferent arteriole, and they're constantly based upon what's happening with the systemic wide blood pressure. They are either shrinking or opening up. In another respect, it's not pictured here, but there's a whole bunch of cells which make up what's known as the mesangium. And the mesangium is this whole network of cells that are gluing basically all these capillaries together. And those cells can actually constrict. So this is showing a nice schematic of that feature. You could have a cross-section here of the glomerular capillaries. You have a capillary here, and you have a capillary here, and in between them is a mesangial cell. Well, if the mesangial cell contracts, it's going to actually pull open the tubes of the glomerulus. It's going to make the bottleneck. It's going to make the bottleneck more severe. It's going to allow more fluid to enter in with the same degree of the same opening, right? Or similarly, if the mesangial cells relax, then the walls of the capillaries retract to some degree, and then it makes the bottleneck less severe. There's less fluid you can get into the capillaries, whereas before, when they were open, there was more fluid you could get into the capillaries of the glomerulus. All right, let's take a look at what some of the cross-sections of these regions look like. The proximal convoluted tubule looks something like this. One of the important features is it has these microvilli on it. And microvilli on the apical side of these cells or any cell will always tell you that it has something to do with nutrient absorption. And by and large, a high percentage of all the filtrate is reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. So the stats here is about 60 to 70% of all the water that is lost is reclaimed. And then about 99% of all the organic molecules, so these would be like your monosaccharides and your amino acids and your vitamins and your lipids and things. About 60 to 70% of the important electrolytes of sodium and chloride ions are absorbed here. And then we come down to the nephron loop. And the nephron loop has got two different parts to it. There's a thin limb, which is shown here. So this would be the thin descending limb. This would be the thin ascending limb. And then this would be the thick ascending limb. And on the thin limb, it is permeable to water, but nothing else. So water is free to leave out of here. And then on the thick limb, it's actually impermeable to water, but it has there's a lot of transport proteins here that are going to pump out sodium, and also chlorine. And that's going to help to establish the osmolarity gradient that I was talking about earlier, which we'll discuss in a minute. But there's going to be about 25% of the water reabsorbed here in the nephron loop. And then most of the remaining salt is also going to be reabsorbed here. And this is what creates the concentration gradient. Okay, in the distal convoluted tubule, there's only about 15% of the fluid remaining. So of all the fluid that was filtrated out, only about 15% makes it to the very last end here. And this is where we have a lot of fine tuning. So this is where there's some transport proteins that are under hormonal control. And they can either activate or shut off to increase or decrease the amount of salt that's being retained, or increase or decrease the amount of acid that you're losing. So this is like the fine tuning segment. And then we have the collecting duct, which looks something like this. Nothing super interesting to say here. All right. If we look at the proximal convoluted tubule, the greater detail, this is a little bit about what's going on here. Again, we have the microvilli. And just to give you an idea of some of the processes that are happening here, some things can be brought in through facilitated diffusion. And there is what's known as a transport maximum here. So like, for example, a transport maximum basically means how much of the transport can carry something at a given time. It only can go up to a certain amount, and then if it doesn't, it will be lost. So for example, people that have a really high blood sugar, the transport maximum is met, and all the transports that would normally pump glucose in or grab glucose and bring it in, they're at full throttle. They can't take in any more, and so you'll actually lose quite a bit of glucose because it didn't have a chance to be reabsorbed readily in the proximal convoluted tubule. That's also can be the case with things like with salt. If glomerular filtration rate is too fast, there might be actually too much salt here in the distal convoluted tubule because there just wasn't enough time for it to be reabsorbed. So that's actually going to be a sensing mechanism that we look at here to determine, sort of like a quality control measure, to determine if glomerular filtration is going as fast as it should or not. There are cells that are well suited to detect how much salt is in the filtrate. Okay, there's also some counter transports here. So an example would be something that like pumped out potassium, let's say, and then pumped in sodium. So these would be antiports, is what they're known as, because it's the one thing flowing down its gradient which pumps the other thing into its gradient. And regardless of what happens, this all gets brought through the epithelial cell into the blood. And that's the way that is reclaimed. Now, there is water that's going to also flow as things are being pumped in across the cell. Water will follow. Water likes to go to the place where there's a higher osmolarity. So if you have particles being pumped in, the water is inclined to follow. It can only do so, though, in this respect, if there are these things called aquaporin channels in here. An aquaporin. And there are aquaporins, there's different kinds. Some of them are constitutively expressed, meaning they're always in the membrane, and so water is always able to pass through. There are others that get inserted into the membrane under the governance of various hormones, and we'll take a look at that difference here in a little bit. Okay, the nephron loop, we'll get into this now. This is how the osmolarity gradient is established. So we have the story looking something like this. As filtrate comes into the nephron loop, it's got about an osmolarity of about 300 milliosmoles per liter. That's close to what blood plasma is. Okay. Well, as water is pulled out in a way, remember the thin limb is the one that's permeable to water, so water can get pulled out. And as water is continued to be pulled out, the fluid is going to get saltier and saltier and saltier and saltier and saltier. Okay. And then, furthermore, now you have this really salty fluid, and now the salt is pumped back out, and that's going to be the thing that helps to sustain the osmolarity gradient. And there's a great video I'll show you that helps to illustrate this. This is always a really difficult thing to understand unless you're watching like a 3D video, but this is called countercurrent multiplication because it requires two currents, one flowing down, one flowing up, to establish the osmolarity gradient in a way that I'm going to show you here in just a second. Okay, here's the video I want to show you.
Welcome to Biomed Sessions with me, Ruse. Today we're going to be discussing the loop of Henle and the way it helps to concentrate urine in the kidneys. The loop of Henle is found between the proximal convoluted tubule and the distal convoluted tubule in the nephron. There are actually two types of nephron in the kidney, cortical and juxtamedullary. This happens to be a juxtamedullary nephron because of its long loop of Henle and the fact that it dips down into the medulla of the kidney. This type is well suited to the role of helping to concentrate urine. As discussed in my function of the nephron video, filtrate moves through the tubules and eventually exits the collecting duct as urine. But what we want to know is, why does the concentration of filtrate increase as you go further down the loop of Henle? Osmolarity is the concentration of a solution, often expressed as milliosmoles per liter. Filtrate in the proximal convoluted tubule has an osmolarity of 300 milliosmoles per liter, the same as the surrounding interstitial fluid. This means that the filtrate is isoosmotic with its surroundings, but it's a very different story in the loop of Henle. Let's zoom in. Let me give you a brief recap of what happens here, but if you want more details, including information about permeability, do go back and watch my previous video. Okay, so in the thick ascending limb, sodium ions are pumped out, and negative ions such as chloride follow, making the medulla a quite concentrated and salty region. Water leaves passively from the thin descending limb because of the surrounding salty environment, and as the water leaves, the filtrate in the descending limb becomes significantly more concentrated. In addition, the salty medulla is also a major reason why water is able to move passively out of the collecting duct and be reabsorbed back into the blood, thus leaving behind more concentrated urine. But let's pretend that the filtrate is entering the loop of Henle for the very first time. Naturally, because the filtrate is coming from the proximal convoluted tubule, it will have the same 300 milliosmoles per liter osmolarity and be isoosmotic with the interstitial fluid. However, this situation is not ideal for creating concentrated urine. So in the latter part of the loop of Henle, our aim is to create a difference of 200 milliosmol per liter between the ascending limb and the interstitial fluid. The only way to do this is by pumping out sodium ions. So let's pump. As you can see, the osmolarity in the ascending limb has decreased due to a loss of sodium, whereas in the interstitial fluid, it has increased due to a gain in sodium. And if you look closely at the values, you will see that we have achieved the 200 milliosmol per liter difference, otherwise known as a gradient. But what's happening with the descending limb? Here the filtrate needs to equilibrate. meaning that the water will leave passively until the filtrate in the descending limb reaches the same osmolarity as the interstitial fluid. Time to equilibrate. Note, equilibrating does not change the osmolarity of the interstitial fluid. Filtrate moves through the nephron continuously, but I'm going to break this down into steps for you. Let's advance the fluid in the loop of Henle. When brand new 300 milliosmol per litre filtrate enters the descending limb from the proximal convoluted tubule, the filtrate already in the loop of Henle is pushed further along. Bringing back our values for the interstitial fluid, we see that our gradient has been messed up. So we need to re-establish that ideal 200 milliosmol per litre difference. Let's pump out some sodium ions. Okay, although the values vary, there is still a difference of 200 at all levels, so we're content. Now to equilibrate the descending limb with the interstitial fluid and advance the fluid in the loop of Henle a little. Lo and behold, the gradient is messed up again, but we know what to do. Let's pump and establish that 200 milliosmol per litre gradient. Equilibrate to match osmolarities and advance the fluid. Okay, one more time to get the point across. Our gradient is messed up. Pump out sodium to restore the gradient and equilibrate. Alright, so looking at our values for the interstitial fluid, we can see that the osmolarity increases the deeper you go into the medulla. As all that pumping and equilibrating continues, we eventually reach a maximum concentration of around 1,200 milliosmols per litre. The entire process that I have just described is called countercurrent multiplication. Countercurrent because the filtrate flows in opposite directions in the limbs of the loop of Henle, and multiplication because this countercurrent flow enables the effects of the gradient to be increased, i.e. multiplied. So in summary, the loops of Henle of juxtamedullary nephrons are involved in the process of countercurrent multiplication, which enables the interstitial fluid to become more concentrated, i.e. increase in osmolarity the deeper you go into the medulla. The high concentrations in the medulla facilitate the passive movement of water out of the collecting duct and result in more concentrated urine.
All right, so there you have it. Okay, let's look at the distal convoluted tubule in greater detail. So there's a couple of interesting features here in the distal convoluted tubule. One is you have these pumps that exchange potassium for sodium. So they will pull sodium out of the tubular fluid to reclaim it, and at the expense of getting rid of potassium. Now, these can be aldosterone sensitive pumps. So when aldosterone is released, it causes more and more salt to be reclaimed, and then the potassium is lost. Well, salt will lead to water coming in because salt is found in high abundance outside of the cell in the interstitial fluid. Potassium is found in pretty low concentration extracellularly. It's found in greater concentration inside the cell, but that doesn't really have the same effect as with water. So if you have sodium accumulating in the interstitial fluid, it's going to be a big draw for water. Okay, it'd be a much bigger draw for water than potassium being localized inside the cell. And so to get sodium out at the expense of getting rid of potassium, water will follow, and that's going to be a helpful thing. Okay. Another thing that can happen is that there is a negative polarity here that forms. So as sodium wants to come in, generally you can't put too many of a certain kind of positive charge into something, otherwise it disrupts the electrical equilibrium. So for every positive charge that comes in, you got to have a positive charge that gets kicked out in order to maintain the polarity across the membrane. And so one of the things that is often ejected is hydrogen ions. Now, another interesting thing about this is that sometimes hydrogen ions can also be kicked out in exchange of potassium ions. So, for example, in conditions of acidosis, let's say you have a lot of hydrogen ions that are accumulate in your blood because you're acidotic. You could be acidotic because of a metabolic disorder or because you're hypoxic. Your energy demand is greater than what oxygen can sustain. That will cause acidosis. Well, if that's the case, sometimes the hydrogen ions will outcompete the potassium ions on these pumps. And so then you're actually getting rid of the hydrogen ions, you're not getting rid of the potassium, and it can actually lead to hyperkalemia, which is an elevated blood potassium level because the hydrogen ions are outcompeting and not enough potassium is being voided or cleared. Okay, there are also some pumps that are just designed to pump toxins and drugs and things like that out of your blood, and this would happen at the distal convoluted tubule. Okay, let's talk then about the collecting duct. So, keeping in mind our osmolarity gradient, we have the following situations. We have a couple different scenarios that could play out. One, let's say that you have a lot of extra fluid and you want to get rid of that fluid. Well, all of the filtrate that's coming through here, it will pass through the renal pyramids, and we have a gradient here. So this would be like 1200 milliosmoles. This would be like 300 milliosmoles. And so you can see like it's really salty down here towards the bottom, and it's not all that salty here towards the top. Well, if this collecting duct was totally permeable, what would happen is that the fluid would come out into these salty areas and try and equilibrate everything. And so you'd actually be reclaiming a bunch of water. But it is not permeable. The permeability of the collecting duct is regulated by a hormone known as anti-diuretic hormone. Anti-diuretic hormone will lead to the insertion of aquaporin 2 channels, as well as some of the other aquaporin channels, but aquaporin 2 channels are pretty common in here. And those are ones that are not constitutively expressed, meaning they only get inserted into the membrane when there's a trigger or a stimulus, in this case, anti-diuretic hormone. Without those being in there, all this fluid is just going to pass through. There isn't going to be any equilibration, and there will be a large amount of volume that is lost, and it will be very dilute urine. Okay, on the flip side then, if let's say you wanted to reclaim as much water as you could, well then anti-diuretic hormone would be released, and its job would be to insert those aquaporin channels into the membrane of the collecting duct so that water can leave and equilibrate with this interstitial fluid. And so now you're seeing, whereas before, if you look at this illustration here of the solute concentration, it's pretty uniform all the way through here. Over here it changes, right? You have it being not very salty, and then as it gets further down it becomes very salty. The osmolarity is going to increase, and this would result to a smaller volume of concentrated urine. So if you want to reclaim water, you'll release anti-diuretic hormone and you will excrete a small volume of highly concentrated urine. On the flip side, if you have water that you need to get rid of, you will excrete a large volume of dilute urine. Okay, now there's two different ways that water is reabsorbed, and we've just illustrated both of those. So just to summarize, obligatory water reabsorption is what happens in the proximal and the descending limb of the nephron loop. Water is reclaimed, and it's reclaimed at a steady rate. The channels here are not, the transport channels are constitutively expressed, so the water just gets reclaimed as it passes along. Facultative water reabsorption, and this is the one that means, this is the type of water reabsorption that varies. It's variable. And so you can alter how much water is going to be reclaimed or not. All right, then this is just a cool figure that shows a nice summary of everything that's going on. You have fluid coming into the proximal convoluted tubule, water is taken out, water is taken out, water is taken out. You have the filtrate getting more and more concentrated, and that equilibrates with the interstitial fluid, so it creates this osmolarity gradient, and then it equilibrates back up as we go up. And then here we have our aldosterone pumps. Some of them are sodium and potassium exchangers. Other ones are sodium and hydrogen ion exchangers. And then the fluid comes down through the collecting duct, and any water that's reclaimed is quickly then collected by the peritubular capillaries and brought back to the cardiovascular system by way of the renal vein. There's a nice summary that's shown here that shows a little bit about all the stuff that's happening. You have 180 liters a day filtrated at the renal corpuscle. The renal corpuscle would be the glomerulus plus the capsule that surrounds it. Okay, the things that are filtrated out, water, inorganic and organic solutes. The things that are not would be plasma proteins and or blood cells. Proximal convoluted tubule, again, 60-70% of the water, almost all of the other organic substrates, and then 60-70% of the salt. You have glucose being reabsorbed, simple sugars being absorbed, amino acids, vitamins, ions. You have urea and chloride ions, lipid-soluble materials, and the things that you're secreting, getting rid of, would be hydrogen ions, ammonium ions, creatinine, drugs, and toxins. Okay, in the nephron loop, this is mostly reclaiming water and sodium and chloride. So this would be 25% of the water, and then 20 to 25% of the sodium. So between the proximal convoluted tubule and the nephron loop, mostly everything that you're going to be reabsorbing has been reabsorbed. Now there's a variable amount of reabsorption that can occur in the distal convoluted tubule. It's usually not as much, only about 5% of the water, and it can change depending on the needs of the body, but you might have some sodium and chloride ions that are reabsorbed here, calcium ions or water, and you might be secreting hydrogen ions, ammonium, and some of these other, the same stuff that you could be secreting in the proximal convoluted tubule could also be secreted in the distal convoluted tubule. Then there's the collecting system, the collecting duct. This is going to be a variable amount of water that's reabsorbed here. It's under antidiuretic hormone. There could be a little bit of reabsorption that occurs here as well, but it would be pretty minimal. And then we have the peritubular capillaries and the vasa recta. Vasa recta is a type of peritubular capillary that's found specifically on juxtamedullary nephrons, the very long loop nephrons. Okay, one last thing here, dialysis, a clinical application. So people that have kidney failure have to have some way to filter out their blood and to get out the nitrogenous waste and excess ions and things. And so this is how it works. They would make a little shunt that is going to bypass, the vessels, the artery and the vein, and then they'll tap into it. Blood will get pulled from the arterial side down in across a pump, a peristaltic pump, and then it will pass through a dialysis chamber. That chamber is bathed with a solution that is going to be a solution that allows the nitrogenous waste to get out, and it also allows some of the other important things to get in. And that dialysis fluid, is monitored. There's a constant temperature that it's at, and it continues to flow through and then drain out. And it's like an artificial way of basically washing the blood in a way. And then when it's all said and done, they pull the tubes out, and they'll have to go on and have probably repeated treatments of this periodically. And I'm not sure how often this happens. I think it's sort of like a weekly thing, as far as I understand it. But it is an interesting advent and an interesting innovation in modern medicine that would allow somebody to survive even with some form of kidney failure or kidney damage. Okay, we're going to stop here, and then we'll pick it back up with a discussion of glomerular filtration rate.